Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Niall Ferguson, who's with us. He's someone who I've been reading his stuff for years, books and everything.
That's
Niall
it.
Ferguson,
All of that.
good to see you.
All of that is true, and it's great to be
And
here.
there's a lot more, but I had to cut it. It's too much.
No, that's fine.
So let me ask you, I guess, first of all, why you're here in Israel. What brings you here at such a crazy time?
I was intended to come here. I'd been invited to participate in a Tikva event, which then was cancelled because those organizing it were called up for military service. And almost immediately, I got a call from your president inviting me to come. And I was delighted because I wanted to come. I don't think anybody can understand what is going on in the Middle East sitting at Stanford or, for that matter, Harvard or even in London. Got to come here. And so I'm here to learn. I'm here to get my ideas updated so that when people ask me questions about the conflict that began October 7th, I have credible answers. I took the same approach to the war in Ukraine. I've been to Kyiv twice in the past 2 years. I don't think you can comment authoritatively on a conflict from a great distance. So
And
it's as
what
simple
have
as
you
that.
learned here?
Well, I only just got here, so
Okay.
give me time. Give me time.
Okay.
I think the most important thing on a trip like this is just keep asking questions. So having agreed to do this interview, I'm on the wrong side of the table. I'll really pause my answers on what's going on here until I've just had a few more days and met a few more people. Bear with me, because I do think part of the problem in our world today is people who like to pontificate on the basis of zero data.
Put on your TV.
I try my best to avoid that.
Yeah. So let me ask you maybe about what's happening in the West, because you live in the West,
Yeah, I can
in
talk about
America
that.
right now. So I guess the question is, since October, I think my dad lives in Brooklyn, New York, and the neighborhood right next to where he lives, the day after October 7th, on October 8th, huge protests, people just saying the most nasty things about just Jews, not Israel, not this. On stores next to where he lives, there was reports of swastikas on the doors where they see the mezuzah, and that's how they know they were Jewish. Like, really, like from medieval times, like just raw anti-Semitism, if I could say. What has happened? Like when I grew up, I don't, at least not on this level, I don't remember this.
Well, I have a son who lives in Brooklyn. My family is quite transatlantic. I spend quite a lot of time in Northern California, near Stanford. Right now, I'm on sabbatical from Stanford. I'm in London. I'm visiting at the London School of Economics. London has also seen disgraceful demonstrations. These demonstrations purport to be in support of the Palestinian people or the people of Gaza, but with shocking and depressing regularity, they turn into explicitly anti-Israel demonstrations and anti-Semitic demonstrations. That one has to be careful here, because a slogan like "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free" can be interpreted in many ways, as you know. But what's interesting in the case of the Stanford campus is that the pro-Palestinian organizations explicitly and aggressively harass Jewish student groups. And indeed, there was a report on this subject published just a couple of days ago. And I could tell you comparable stories of campuses elsewhere in the United States. Harvard got a lot of attention in the last 3 or 4 months, but in fact, what happened at Harvard wasn't unusual. It's depressingly the norm that on American campuses, student groups purporting to be the Muslim student group, the Palestinian student group, they have many different names, have, I think, quite consciously targeted Jewish students as well as Jewish student groups. And the behavior has been aggressive as well as anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. And I think that's a disturbing feature of this, that there are elements of physical harassment in some cases. So what's going on? I think those of us I'm a historian who studied anti-Semitism, who've studied anti-Semitism, are a little surprised because we didn't notice that the old forms of anti-Semitism that we can trace a long way back in European history have some new friends. And those new friends include Islamism, which did not play a big part in, say, university life 20 years ago, but now is quite well represented within universities. And also the new left. By that I mean people whose take on the history of the Middle East is a kind of caricature from Fanon and Said, in which Israel is a settler colonialist state. And it's amazing how influential that argument has become. So there's this new and weird alliance between the kind of old-style anti-Semitism of the right, which I don't think is particularly prevalent in universities. In fact, it's non-existent in universities, plus Islamists who've been very good at forming alliances with, thirdly, the leftists. And between them, these groups are doing a pretty good job of undermining the legitimacy of the State of Israel in the wider public mind. I think that's the thing to be worried about when you look at polling in the US, in the UK, in other European countries too. It is very shocking to find that young people have a radically different view of the legitimacy of the State of Israel from older people. Something has gone horribly wrong in education in the West. I wish I could sit here and tell you, I have a great solution to this problem. I can fix it by Tuesday. This is going to take a long time to fix.
Well, I think one of the things that maybe can fix it is what you are part of with the, I think, University of Austin, maybe, right, where they're trying to, and I think in Israel also, like Tikva and these organizations were trying to, well, in Israel, even the more progressive universities are not like Harvard or whatever, but still trying to bring in new ideas and give a place for people who can, a lot of the things that I think also maybe you agree with me that campuses have is the fear. People are scared to promote ideas that are different from the common, like Said is so prevalent in the Middle East studies. You can almost not bring up other philosophers, other, ideas, which I think is the big problem here.
Well, let's start with the second point you made, the fear.
Right. Heterodox
Academy does a regular survey of campus life, and on the latest data, 59% of students across the United States say that they're afraid to speak their mind and engage in self-censorship, and the main reason is what their contemporaries will say or do. It's not the professor will give me a bad grade. Some people say that, but the majority say it's because of concern about what their classmates will say. There's comparable research done by the FIRE organization, the Foundation for, what is it again? Individual something or other, an expression. Is that it? Because they changed the name recently. Greg Lukianov is a friend of mine, kind of broadened the scope of FIRE. FIRE is an enormously important organization, and their data show that if one goes to almost any major university, there's this problem. I was speaking at Princeton recently. I looked at the data. It was shocking. Chicago is supposed to be the home of free speech. Yeah. It's no different. It's kind of very similar, the extent to which people self-censor. So fear is in the air on campus. And whatever the issue, whether it's Israel and the Palestinians or transgender rights, which is another one, or police violence against African Americans, there are a whole bunch of hot-button issues that it's quite hazardous to have a dissident view on, i.e. to disagree with the progressive orthodoxy. And this progressive orthodoxy is imposed quite aggressively. Cancel culture is shorthand for a whole bunch of ways in which people have their lives made miserable if they step out of line. And indeed, even tenured professors have found themselves on the wrong side of this. Turns out tenure doesn't really protect you because it's free speech on campus as long as you don't say the following 10 things, which will get you into deep trouble. So what do we do about that? I think it's really hard. I mean, I speak with bitter experience. It's really hard to change the established elite institutions because there are very large numbers of people who align themselves with this progressive orthodoxy and believe it's legitimate to, for example, heckle speakers, prevent speakers from getting their views across. And it's quite deeply embedded so that older professors are kind of still broadly in favor of free speech, but the younger you go in the faculty, and then you get down to the PhD students, the more illiberal the attitudes are. So, in fact, I would predict, far from there being a pendulum that swings back towards free expression, the pendulum will keep swinging towards limiting expression because younger academics seem to think that limiting expression is legitimate for a whole range of issues. Conclusion, you can't really fix the established institutions fast. They'll probably get worse, even if occasionally you get a president to resign. We therefore need to build new institutions. We're doing that in Austin, Texas. The University of Austin's designed to model academic freedom and meritocracy, because we believe that promotion should not be based on the views you hold or the color of your skin or anything else. It should be based on whether you're a good or bad scholar. And we're going to try and show at least the United States how it's done. And I believe that if we succeed, and we admit our first students this coming autumn, we will at least exert some pressure on the established institutions to reform their governance. Because at root, these problems reflect failures of governance. And we've kind of reinvented university governance. That was like my big project last year, to write a constitution for the university. And I think we have at least tried to set a new standard. If we're successful, then people will, I think, come around to copy us because, and this is the good news, there are plenty of young people who do not want to self-censor, who want university to be a place where they can explore ideas without fear of reprisals. And so I'm not utterly despairing. In fact, I was hugely heartened to meet the incoming class of what will be 2028, the people we're admitting to be students at the University of Austin just the other weekend. And they were great. They were really, really exciting and excited. And I came away from that thinking, we've got this. There really is a body of young people thirsting for intellectual freedom and thirsting for the opportunity to challenge their existing opinions. That's the key. If you think at the age of 17 or 18, you know it all, you have a problem. Because you don't. In fact, more or less everything that you think at the age of 17 is wrong and will be shown to be wrong if you study in the right way. That was certainly my experience of 3 years as an undergraduate at Oxford back in the dim and distant past in the early 1980s. The whole point of it was to be challenged. And also the part of the point of being an undergraduate then was to say wild and reckless things, to see if the contrarian view might be right. And if there had been cancel culture in the 1980s, I'd probably not exist. I would have been cancelled into oblivion. But thankfully, it didn't exist then. So
the internet wasn't there. So you have a history.
It was an innocent time. I mean, we would conduct our battles in the library suggestions book.
Yeah, not on Twitter or some Slack thing where people could take screenshots and then
correct
cancel you or whatever, shame you.
This is it. And I think we don't understand fully how much damage we've done to the younger generation with the ubiquitous social media platforms and smartphones. And I think Jonathan Haidt has a good book on this that's just come out. We've created a mental health crisis amongst young people by creating this panopticon in which your every utterance, no matter how casual, is likely to be put on TikTok by some person you thought was your friend. This is awful. I mean, this makes 1984 seem like a quite congenial society to live in, because at least the telescreen is only on the wall of your apartment. But it's now, the telescreen is now everywhere, and everybody's under surveillance. And vigilante contemporaries can publicly humiliate you and destroy your life. That has to end. And so one just little afterthought, one of the rules I want to see at the University of Austin is the Chatham House rule in class, which means that nothing that anybody says in class can be attributed out of class. It would be actually a disciplinary offense to say...
Sort of like off record when you're like talking to journalists.
We should be off the record in class, and we should not have devices. There should not be recordings of discussions. People have to feel safe. I hate that word safe. I'm sick of safe. And safe spaces. The hell with it. It should be risky, and intellectual life should have some element of danger in it. But not the danger that if you say something stupid in class, you'll be held up to public ridicule for the rest of your life. That kind of risk is too great.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing that I saw yesterday. Just happened to see it. There's a Harvard professor, intellectual called Roland Fryer, and he's in economics in Harvard, and he had a study where he basically took like unbelievable amount of data about police brutality, and he found that in people getting shot by police, if I'm not mistaken, there was no difference really between blacks and whites. And when he started trying to publish it, he got immense blowback, and he said his own friends stopped talking to him, and the president of Harvard started making trouble for him. And then he was in this whole thing where he was, they said he sexually was advancing on one of his students. In the end, it was found to be not true, but his whole academic career was basically destroyed from that moment on, because it wasn't, it was about the time of the Black Lives Matter protests, and it wasn't, what you were supposed to think. So just an anecdote.
So Roland is a close friend of mine. And if you want to get an example of the iniquities of modern academia, it would be hard to find a better one. Because you didn't mention, I think, that Roland himself is black. I mean,
I don't think that's relevant for me, but I guess it's relevant for others.
Knowing that Roland Fryer, who's a brilliant man, an extraordinary economist, grew up entirely on the wrong side of the tracks in Texas. He didn't know his mother. His father was in jail. He was raised by his grandmother. He escaped the criminal justice system by a hair's breadth. And because of his prodigious mathematical talent, found his way from the football team into scholarship and then to the University of Chicago. He had a meteoric rise and was one of the youngest black academics to be tenured at Harvard. And then Roland made the mistake of following the results of his research where they led, and they led in places that were not in conformity with progressive orthodoxy. He did work on charter schools that showed that they worked and delivered great results for children in lower income groups. And then he tackled the issue of police violence, probably the most sensitive issue around the time of Black Lives Matter, and showed that there was no data to support the claim that the police disproportionately used lethal violence against African Americans. Actually, the data pointed slightly in the opposite direction, though they did use more low-level physical...
like pushing people in cars.
Right. So they were more likely to use that kind of jostling, shoving, pushing around on African American suspects. So to cut this long story short, what happened was he got a lot of blowback. A lot of people told him, oh, you shouldn't publish the data. We talked a lot about it. The data were published. The New York Times ran a big story. Roland worried about security for himself and his family. I have a little bit of experience of that because my wife, Ayan Hirsi Ali, has been threatened with violence for, 20 years or so. So we know how that works. But what I didn't foresee and what he didn't foresee was that he would be targeted for harassment in a bogus Me Too type allegation. And it was actually a former assistant who claimed harassment. The evidence turned out to be a few jokey text messages. There was absolutely no evidence or even allegation of physical contact. And yet these trivial social lapses were the basis for a witch hunt against him, which Claudine Gay, as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences before she became president of Harvard, did everything to advance. And it was she who demanded a very severe penalty for Roland, which was 2 years suspension without pay and the closure of his lab. I thought of all the cases that I came across in the past 10 years of cancel culture, this was the most egregious, not least because its target was the kind of person that we would want American academic life to encourage. Roland does not speak like a white progressive liberal who went to a private school. He doesn't at all. And if you don't believe me, you should check out the amazing interview that he did just the other day with Barry Weiss at the University of Austin. It's a great interview, podcast of the year already. You know, we should just declare the contest over. And it's funny. It's very frank, with occasional expletives, because he's Roland. And you'll see why they had to go after him, because Roland believes in truth. He's old-fashioned. He believes you go where the data lead you without fear, and he paid a heavy price for that. I mean, you're not wrong to say that his reputation was almost entirely destroyed. And I've been, I hope, somebody who's contributed to the fight back, because I believe that Harvard owes him a considerable amount of money and a full apology. It hasn't yet happened, but it's going to come. And it's going to be a great day when they acknowledge that they treated him grotesquely, and those involved in his mistreatment should hang their heads in shame.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that basically, I mean, you basically answered it, but I'll just ask. You wrote a piece, I think, for Barry Weiss's publication about what, and the thing was the treason of the intellectuals. I'm pretty sure we don't even have to talk about it because we basically spoke about it now, but maybe you could explain why there is such a treason of the intellectuals, why you think one of the things that, like you said, the younger generation of intellectuals are not intellectuals at all, because intellectuality, I think, the way we thought about it before, was a curiosity, an openness to new ideas, a place where you doubt your own ideas, and that's how you learn new, you get to the truth. Or even just science. Science is where you try and we are out of that anymore. There's no more of that, it seems, at least in the younger generation. Where do you think it comes from?
I can't think of an article I've written in the last 10 years that has had more impact than the Treason of the Intellectuals essay I wrote for Barry Weiss's Free Press. And the argument's a simple one, but a powerful one. I take the story back to the 1920s. And a book called The Treason of the Intellectuals, Treason by a French writer, academic, intellectual, Julien Bonda. And this is a very interesting little book in which he says the intellectuals, the professors and public intellectuals of the 1920s have committed a treason to scholarship because they've become political activists. Now, in his time, the problem was academics leaning right, academics who embraced the radical right, endorsed it, and used their positions, including academic positions, to propagate its ideas. My argument in the essay was, we should not be surprised to find anti-Semitism at Harvard and other elite universities, because a similar treason of the intellectuals has happened in our time. And just because it's a treason to the left rather than a treason to the right doesn't matter, because anybody who decides to abuse their position as an intellectual to engage in political activism is violating Max Weber's great rule that he promulgated, I think, during World War I, that there was a fundamental difference between the vocation of politics and the vocation of scholarship. It's Politik und Wissenschaft. And Weber argued that there has to be a strict separation, and I've always believed that. I read that essay when I was an undergraduate. As a professor, I always consciously left my politics at the threshold of the lecture hall in the belief that I should not abuse my power as a professor to propagate my political views, because most political views are conjectural in nature. They're statements essentially about the future, which are quite hard to substantiate with data. One should therefore have a certain humility in making political statements, whereas scholarly statements have to be based, in my view, on data, on evidence. That's a very important rule for the historian. So we have a similar treason of the intellectuals. Where did the treason of the intellectuals lead? in the 1920s? Well, it led, in the case of Germany, to professors who embraced National Socialism. It is a not well-known fact, but an important one, that academics and students were quicker to embrace National Socialism than the generality of German society. And, we remember the famous ones, Heidegger being perhaps the most famous, but it was generally true that the elite German universities embraced National Socialism early. Not only did they embrace it, not only did they drive Jewish professors and students out of the universities without much need for the state to be involved, also they provided what might be called the operating software for the ideology that, when Hitler sketched it in Mein Kampf, was pretty crude. The final solution of the Jewish question required a whole bunch of professors and doctoral students to devise implementation, and devise it they did. One cannot get away from the complicity of the German academic elite in the Holocaust. It's one of the most shocking facts of history that the most educated society in the world in the interwar period produced the Holocaust. And anybody who believes that education's some magic bullet that will make everything good in a society doesn't know German history. Friedrich Meinecke wrote about this in Die Deutsche Katastrophe, The German Catastrophe, a very important book that nobody now reads. So, conclusion. If it was possible for Heidelberg and Tübingen and Königsberg, the great German universities, to be complicit in the Holocaust, could it not be possible for Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford one day to be complicit in another Holocaust? I see at this point no compelling evidence why that should not be the case. And that is the thing that is most horrific to me about recent events, that there should be demonstrations of an anti-Semitic nature at these universities, and that professors should line up to defend a president who seems unable explicitly to condemn them. All of this is deeply troubling to me.
Yeah. One of the things that I also wanted to ask you about, and then we'll go maybe also on what's happening here in our area, but one of the things that I see, and it's almost like you said in the beginning, the people who are now protesting will automatically call Israel colonization, colonial project. So I guess two questions. Number one, what I don't understand is, and maybe you can explain to me, and you study this, colonialism is usually, if I understand correctly, when people, or England, let's say, send people to colonize somewhere in order to bring back spoils back to England. The Jews who came here, it seems, stayed. They didn't bring spoils back to, I don't know where, Poland or Germany, where, like, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. Their whole family's dead from Poland. So they didn't obviously send anything back. So I guess, could we say that makes Israel less of a colonial project, if at all? And my second question is, just in colonialism in general, why is it so today, why can't we take a nuanced approach? Because if you look, let's say, at Africa or places which were colonized, I assume, it seems to me that they're more advanced economically, a lot of them. They're more intellectual, even though we're not sure that that's good. But, I mean, do you see sort of is there any way to have a nuanced approach on this issue?
There is a way, and it's extremely important that we take a nuanced approach. I wrote a book more than 20 years ago now called Empire, which was about the British Empire. And its subtitle was, I think, How Britain Made the Modern World. And the point about the book was that Britain made it in good and in bad ways. Most of history is the history of empires. I hate to break it to you all, but that is really what we call history. It's largely empires that from the beginning produced the kind of records that historians can study. And there are empires all over the world in all the different continents. Great Chinese empires, empires in Africa, empires in Central and South America. This is what human societies do when they scale. They produce empires. And for some odd reason, which has to do with wrong turnings of scholarship, of historiography, we started to use different language, often very moralistic language, to talk about the European empires that arose in the period after the 15th century. Now, let's take the one that got to be the biggest, though it wasn't the earliest, the British Empire. the British Empire certainly did colonialism just about everywhere. The United States is a pretty good product of settler colonialism because it was mostly British people who started to settle in large numbers on the eastern seaboard of North America. The French did it too. Spaniards had been at it for longer further south, but that's a sort of the essence of a settler colonial project was that in the great tradition of the original colonies in the ancient Greek world, Scottish and English and Irish people crossed the Atlantic and established communities in what they called New England that initially were designed to be self-sustaining, but engaged in large-scale trade with the metropole, with the motherland back on the other side of the Atlantic. This is how it worked. Now, in other parts of the world, when the British turned up and to engage in trade, there wasn't much settling to be done because the land was already heavily settled. This is the case of the Indian subcontinent. But the British take it over anyway, and they run it as a company up until the so-called mutiny of 1857, and then they run it as a government colony. There's not much settling going on because the number of British people who settle in South Asia is relatively small compared with North America. But there's some. I mean, there's certainly families that take root there, as there are families that take root in Southern Africa and in Kenya, where I spent part of my childhood. This is the story of modernity. The story of modernity is large numbers of people going from Europe and making new lives in other continents. It's the story of Russia. It's the story of Russians from west of the Urals going east of the Urals and creating their own settler colonial empire extending as far as Vladivostok. Okay, so let's come to this case of the Middle East. In the Middle East, these processes occur on top of centuries of history in which the Jews played a very significant part. Like there were Jews here a long, long time ago, just as there were Jews in Baghdad. And there were Christians too. It was called the Holy Land for a reason. Everybody thought it was holy. And so to start talking about the project of the Jewish state as settler colonialism is a category error from the get-go, because it's really about trying to institutionalize the long-standing Jewish presence in the region. The Zionist idea goes back to the late 19th century. It gets a real tailwind in World War I, which produces the Balfour Declaration. I'm sorry to do Middle Eastern History 101, but we have to do it. And the British decide, you know what, let's get in behind this idea. It could be strategically to our advantage, and if we don't do it, the Germans may. So there is a colonial project. It's called the Mandate. The British run Palestine the way they run quite a lot of places. They ran Egypt this way. And they run it with their usual competence, but the problem is that there is considerable conflict between Arabs and Jews, just as there are problems of conflict that the French have to handle in Lebanon, which they're running. And indeed, the whole patchwork of the region after World War I is, I think, best characterized as rather weak imperial administrations, mostly British or French, confronting nascent state formation by Arabs and by Jews. And it's in both cases nascent. It's not like there had been long-standing Arab nation states. There hadn't been. This is all taking place in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, everything is empire.
Right.
The Ottoman Empire was what ran the Middle East for a very long time. And the British and the French were trying to kind of assemble their own colonial projects in its ruins. Fast forward to the Holocaust. In the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the sustained effort by the Nazi regime to annihilate the Jews of Europe, it was a not unreasonable argument that the Jews should have a state of their own, not be the beneficiaries of British rule, but have their own nation state, because history made it clear that without that, they were vulnerable to annihilation. I mean, this was a not unreasonable inference for your family and for many other families of Jews I know. So what they did was an anti-colonial struggle against British rule. And they used fair means and foul to found the State of Israel, including terrorism. The bombing of the King David Hotel, I think, was the first event I ever remember being told about by my father when I was a kid. It wasn't something that was a popular event in my part of the world, but there it was. Everywhere in the 1940s and 1950s, the British confronted anti-colonial independence movements everywhere.
In India, for example.
In Ireland, everywhere. There had been struggles. They had begun really in the early 20th century in the case of places like Ireland. It got serious during the First World War. By the mid-1940s, it's pretty much everywhere. And what happens in Israel is really no different from what happens in India and Pakistan. And the British finally say, we just can't fight these people anymore. There are too many of them. We don't have enough money. We just fought the Germans in 2 world wars. We're kind of broke. And so what happens is the very opposite of settler colonialism. It's decolonization. That's the history of Israel. It's decolonization. The British, as everywhere else, have to exit, and they leave in the wake of their exit conflicts between Jews and Arabs, conflicts between Indian Hindus and Indian Muslims. That's the story of decolonization. That's what we should be talking about in the classrooms and explaining how in all of these different contexts, the retreat of British rule led to varying degrees of violence, depending on how the local rivalries played out. So what happens seems to me to be completely mischaracterized as settler colonialism. The exact opposite is true.
Yeah. One of the things that I just wanted to touch on, but very shortly, because I wanted to ask you about the actual, I know you said you want to learn, but I have just a few questions about how it relates to the U.S. in terms of diplomacy and the Biden administration. But I just wanted to say one thing, that it seems to me that there is a sort of like very simplistic view of in academia, but also in general, about where you have the strong and the weak, and we're always going to be on the side of whoever is perceived to be the weak, even though the weak might not be right. And in the Talmud, it says that you have to, when you judge someone, you shouldn't judge the poor and the rich differently. But it seems to me that that's where we are, in the sense that there's always going to be the oppressed and the oppressor, and it's a sort of binary decision. And it's so simplistic, and it's just very weird that is the general consensus of where we need to look. Like, Hamas is weaker. They don't have F-16s. Therefore, we're going to say that Israel is the aggressor. Just for example, I mean, it's just very, very weird in terms of like common sense.
Yes. How does one define strength and weakness
exactly
in the Middle East? There's another empire which is quite active in this region, which is Iran.
Right.
And the Persian Empire has gone through some strange metamorphoses over time, but since 1979, it has been a theocratic, authoritarian regime with an explicit commitment to the destruction of the State of Israel, amongst other things. And so it seems to me, if one does a head count, that Iran and its proxies are not exactly weak relative to Israel, and that in fact Israel, to any kind of visiting Martian, would look like a pretty beleaguered, weak society relative to the surrounding hostile neighbors, especially if it can't make peace with its Arab neighbors. Now, that's how I think about it. If you just want to zoom in on Gaza, you can come to a very different conclusion, but I don't think anybody who just zooms in on Gaza is going to understand the broader geopolitical situation in which proxies of Iran operating throughout the region, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. These proxies are extraordinarily well armed, and that's not because they went on Amazon and bought the weapons with their credit cards. They're given the weapons by Iran, and Iran is accumulating significant amounts of wealth since the easing of sanctions after 2020. So this is the way I see it, and it's kind of ludicrous to caricature Israel as the oppressors and Palestinians as the oppressed in this context. This is like a cartoon version of the situation.
But I also want to say that I agree with you 100%. But even if Israel was the stronger, was the not the oppressed, but the strong party, it doesn't matter. It depends who's right and who's wrong. And just on a moral level, it's very weird to me that if someone is, let's say, rich and the other person's poor, automatically the rich is wrong and the poor is right. That's not a way that we should just in general look at the world, it seems to me.
Well, if we take a kind of microcosm version, if a wealthy family's home is broken into
Right.
by criminals and they commit rape and murder, by and large, the criminal justice system in most countries would regard the criminals as criminals and the wealthy family as victims. So, we can put it that simply. I share your perplexity. I don't quite get why so many people were more outraged by Israel's retaliation than they were by the original aggression. I'll struggle with that maybe for the rest of my life. There are people I know who spend a lot of time on social media retweeting content that is hostile to Israel. I don't remember them being so active on social media in the immediate wake of October the 7th. They were strangely silent about what had been done to Israeli civilians and soldiers on that Black Day. And I just think if you can't tell the difference between aggression and retaliation, if you don't understand that fundamental distinction, then you shouldn't really be trying to comment on historical events of any sort.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to say that, and I know we don't have all the time in the world, so I just want a small comment about the whole intersectional coalition where for some reason the Jews aren't on it. Yeah. And also like they're considered white. And I was looking yesterday at the poll, like the census of Israel, where you see that the Ashkenazic Jews, the white Jews in quotes, are a very small minority now because they have less kids, and they're like me. I'm Ashkenazic. I married a Persian. And so my kids are already half, and it's very, like, to say that all the Jews are, it's very weird.
Well, the racism of the New Left is one of the odder phenomena of our time. I'll never really understand why, as we were progressing towards the colorblind society that Martin Luther King dreamt of, that my friend Coleman Hughes talks about, that the left decided, no, we actually should have exactly. Blacks only halls of residence and days when whites don't come on campus, and in fact to reintroduce ideas of segregation. Intersectionality is a strange thing. It's a way of attacking the concept of individual liberty and equality by stacking everybody into identity groups in an elaborate matrix in which entirely arbitrary categorization occurs. So gender is entirely fluid. You and I can become women tomorrow.
But race, we can't change.
Right. So that's very interesting. So we have essentialism of race, but not of sex and gender. And then the kind of arbitrary ranking that puts Jews near the bottom with the dreaded white males. I mean, you and I are like basically at the bottom of the Premier League of victimology. I mean, this is all, sorry to use foul language, bullshit.
Yeah.
And to anybody who believes in a free society in which we are, as individuals, given certain liberties, but also responsibilities, all of this is entirely odious and should be rejected. I am married to a woman who was born in Somalia, who would be classified as black. She's actually a rather pleasant shade of brown. I'm kind of pink, as my sons like to remark. We have two boys. They are half Scottish, half Somali, all American and all British, because they're dual citizens. And the one thing that would really depress me deeply would be if my sons were judged by society primarily according to the color of their skin. Pigmentation is a trivial feature of humanity. It's a trivial, superficial distinction between people. It should not matter. And in our family, it does not matter, because I have children by my first marriage who are about as pink as me. It doesn't matter. Isn't that the simplest takeaway? Why have the left in the academic world decided to make race matter again? Do they not understand the harm that this will ultimately do? And it will ultimately do harm to everybody.
Yeah. I remember when Barack Obama was elected, I didn't vote for Obama, but I felt that at least we're going away. We could finally get over the sort of racism that not like black people can't be. And he wasn't elected by a lot of people because he was black. He was elected because they liked the guy. Obviously, there were some. But then we somehow, like in the last decade or even a little bit more, just progressed backwards, like you're saying, and it's become so extreme. And also, I think that's where it comes the queers for Palestine sort of thing. It comes from that intersectionality where groups are pitted against each other and there's coalitions which don't make any sense in any rational person. Okay, I want to get to something else. We could talk about this for years.
We agree on all this.
Yeah.
This is not great podcasting. You're supposed to have some disagreement.
No, I like talking to people I agree with. No one else. Our views usually aren't expressed on the regular media, so that's good. Well, it's not good that they're expressed. It's good that we're talking about them. I guess my next question is, one of the things that we've been seeing the past few weeks is that, and it seems in the Israeli press, I'm not sure about America, but that the Biden administration is using, at least that's how I'm reading it, the aid and the support that it's giving Israel to try to force it to go to a two-state solution. One of the things that yesterday or the day before was in one of the Israeli newspapers was that the Americans are thinking of unilaterally recognizing a Palestinian state, meaning they'll just say there's a Palestinian state, even though it's not, there is no Palestinian state. And that will put pressure on Israel in terms of in The Hague, the Palestinians will get a membership and they could sue Israel and all different, instead of Israel, we might go to a Palestinian state, but it should be our decision. Do you think that because the Biden administration is in a bind politically towards the election, places like Michigan and other places, they feel that they must be seen as pressuring the Jewish state?
So what I'm about to say naturally has a political character to it, because I'm going to criticize the Biden administration, and I might even say some things in favor of the Trump administration. But I'm going to try and do this as an historian, not as a partisan political advocate. If one looks back on what was done under Donald Trump, in the Middle East, it was remarkably successful. The Abraham Accords were a success. There was a clear improvement in relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Iran was quite effectively contained by sanctions. The assassination of Soleimani was a very effective show of American strength, to which the Iranians had no response. And all of this was really going much better than anybody had expected. I was one of the few people who wrote saying that I kind of liked Jared Kushner's ideas. Nobody said anything positive about Jared Kushner in the American press, to my knowledge, apart from that. Fast forward to 2021. A new administration comes in, Europeans cheer, the adults are back in the room, it's all going to be great. And what does this new administration do? Well, to my mind, inexplicably, it decides to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal, which had been dead, had been effectively killed, was never a particularly great idea to begin with. But they decide to resurrect it and therefore ease the economic pressure on Iran. And Iran very quickly channels those new resources into its proxies. And those proxies begin to act up even before October the 7th. Because the Biden administration had this idée fixe that it was going to improve relations with Iran, and had certainly people within the administration who were very strongly committed to that, it made a major mistake, which was it stopped deterring Iran. Just as it didn't deter Russia from escalating its invasion of Ukraine, just as it certainly didn't deter the Taliban from retaking control of Afghanistan and imposing Sharia, they failed to deter Iran. And that translated into the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad attacks of October 7th and the Houthis attacks on shipping and the attacks on American forces that are being conducted by various militias in Syria and so on. And it's not over, because we all know that Hezbollah is sitting on a much bigger arsenal of weapons than Hamas had. trying to decide whether they're going to go and use them. That decision will be taken in Tehran. Now, I think that's the background to the situation that Joe Biden and his national security team now find themselves in. They thought, prior to October the 7th, that they kind of done okay in the Middle East. And Jake Sullivan's article in Foreign Affairs will be quoted by historians for many years to come as an example of the myopia problem in policymaking. They were so focused on containing China that they basically didn't realize the unintended consequences of their appeasement of Iran. And when they happened, Jake Sullivan had to do one of the most embarrassing rewrites in the history of the magazine Foreign Affairs to try to excuse the fact that he'd missed what was coming. I knew people who saw what was coming. My friend and colleague Jay Menz had been consistently warning that this was going to blow up. So I think they're now in a very, very difficult situation because they have an election in November. Their candidate is behind in the polls. In a swing state, Michigan, the policy on the Israel-Palestinian question is a major problem because there are many Muslim voters in Michigan. What do? Well, the answer is on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 after October 7th, Joe Biden says all the right things, comes here, gives a great speech. Everybody's happy with him. Looks like, Joe isn't so bad. And I'm sitting there thinking, just wait and see. Just wait and see what happens. And it was predictable that after a very short period of time, the Americans started saying, oh, well, what you're doing in Gaza, we don't really like that. That's not quite what we had in mind. You kind of start thinking about winding this down. Can we maybe do a negotiation where you get the hostages, but you release all the terrorists, etc.? And I think this puts Israel in an invidious position. Clearly, what happened on October the 7th cannot happen again. It cannot be allowed to happen again. That means that it is quite right to set out to destroy Hamas. That is a legitimate objective of war. It's an extremely difficult thing to do given the way that Hamas operates, given the use of human shields, given the tunnel system. But I think actually the Israel Defense Forces have been doing amazingly well under those circumstances. And yet, the noise in the US and in Europe and in the UK is, well, either it's ethnic cleansing or it's genocide. I mean, if they move the civilians out of the way, it's ethnic cleansing. If they don't, it's genocide, which is kind of the definition of you can't win. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The good news is that I think the defeat of Hamas is attainable, regardless of the pressure that the US puts on the Israeli government. The bad news is that the two-state solution grows more popular outside Israel as it becomes less popular and indeed inconceivable inside Israel. How can you have a two-state solution if the overwhelming majority of Israelis don't think it's a viable option? I mean, it's not happening. It's not going to happen. And I said at the Munich Security Conference to a group that included quite a number of Arabs, I have bad news for you. There is not going to be a Palestinian state. Get over it. There's not going to be a Scottish state either. Sometimes you just don't get a state. And maybe it's not the worst thing. Is it bad that Scotland isn't an independent country right now? No. Actually, Scotland would not be a viable independent state. And Palestinians just have to deal with it. Because I don't think there is a viable two-state solution in my lifetime. And we should stop pretending that it's a solution that can be attained in my lifetime or indeed in your lifetime and just come to terms with that reality and ask ourselves the much more interesting question, if that's the case, then what? Then what is going to happen in Gaza, the West Bank? How can we bring peace to the wider region? How can we disarm Iran's proxies so that people can live in peace in the parts of Israel that they've had to be evacuated from? Let's talk about those practical questions instead of talking about a non-achievable Palestinian state.
Yeah, and I would also just add about these. You talked about the Israelis, and I totally agree. Israeli society has shifted very much against, first of all, in general, to the right, which is a weird dynamic where because the government is on the right, so the center-left is gaining in the polls, but the actual opinions all move to the right. And number two, we should talk about the Palestinians themselves in polls. 80% in the West Bank supporting I'm not sure Hamas or the October 7th, but very, very large numbers supporting the October 7th attack, very large numbers supporting, say, who vote for Hamas if the elections, which is why Mahmoud Abbas is like 19 years on a 4-year term limit.
Yeah.
So I think we should talk about who the other side is. And I don't agree with you that it can't be achieved. I think I would be against it.
I said in my lifetime.
I think it could be.
I'm about to turn 60.
I think it could be achieved even if your lifetime. It would be a negative thing to happen. And I think that but it should be achieved only if there is some sort of Bibi calls it denazification, but I think just more of a general something to change in, first of all, the way they incite against Jews on their just regular textbooks, the way the UN agencies that are helping them are actually facilitating terror. This has nothing to do even with a two-state solution. This can't happen even if there isn't one, but obviously any two-state solution needs to be predicated on the fact that they don't want to kill us. And that, as you said, seems unlikely to happen. So
right.
So
a Palestinian state, were it to be conjured up at this point, would be a failed state.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it can't be a rational policy goal to create another failed state. The world already has quite a few of them, and they're expensive.
Yeah.
So, let me try to offer an historian's perspective. I come from a country that is not an independent state. But I don't think anybody seriously believes that Scotland is a victim of English settler colonialism. The thing about Scotland that's interesting is that in the 16th and 17th century, it was as violent a place as anywhere in the Middle East today. It was characterized by appalling levels of religious and tribal violence between Catholics and Protestants, between Highlanders and Lowlanders. It really was as bad a place as you could find in the world today, and that's quite measurable in terms of homicide rates, quality of life, etc. Something happened in the late 18th century that transformed the country. The end of the 1745 rebellion was followed by, with amazing rapidity, an economic miracle and a philosophical miracle. Scotland, by the end of the 18th century, was without question the fastest growing economy on the planet, and it had the Enlightenment. Now, in the Scottish Enlightenment, all the good ideas that have ever been had were had. You don't need to have any new ideas. They were all had in the Scottish Enlightenment. The key to success is the Scottish Enlightenment. Just read the works of Smith, of Ferguson, of Hume, draw the correct inferences, and get on with life. It's all done. Like the operating system exists for a free, prosperous society. And Scotland went from being Afghanistan, which I think is roughly what it was in the 17th century, to being kind of South Korea. So it can be done anywhere. If the Scots could get it together and find prosperity and peace and build a society that was the envy of the world, then anywhere can do it. This was the message of my book, Civilization. Civilization is not race-specific, culture-specific, religion-specific. Anybody can get that operating system to work. And so we shouldn't be fatalistic about the Palestinians. We shouldn't be fatalistic even about the Afghans or the Somalis. The problem is that the institutions and incentives they currently have are bound to lead them to organized lethal violence. And until you've changed the institutions and incentives, including educational institutions, you will not get anywhere. And conjuring up a Palestinian state at this point, it would be as unsuccessful as if Scotland had been given its own state in 1744.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask something that maybe is a little bit personal also, but I think it does have impacts on the general situation. One of the things that Western values, one of the things that I understood Western values throughout maybe hundreds of years already, is the fact that we have a sort of community, or maybe not a religion, but a star that takes us somewhere, that we know where to look when we're going to where we're going. And I think in the last decades, maybe, there's been you could see just in the polls, the number of people attending church has gone down dramatically. Synagogue for the Jews in America is, intermarriage is, I think, taking a lot of toll in terms of the attendance and reform and conservative Judaism, but also among Christians. In European countries, the secular movement has been you see places even where we're very strong Catholic communities, nobody's in church anymore. And I think what happens is, and you maybe agree with me, maybe not, you have a more atomization of the people where they're all the time on their phone, and that's their God in a large sense. And they're finding communities where in a bad place, like you said, on TikTok, in all this wokeism, which is being promulgated on these platforms. And so, in a way, and also one last thing about that is that when you talked about the Balfour Declaration, I'm bringing you back to Israel, which is weird, was that a lot of the British intellectuals, I think, that supported the Zionism were very religious people, very Christian religious, even Christian Zionists, we could maybe call them in retrospect. And I think a lot of the British public today they're not there anymore. And maybe also in America, they're not there anymore. Like the evangelicals are losing a lot of ground in terms of attendance and people who say they like Israel and so forth. So what do you think about, the reason why I told this personal is because I saw when you were on Matan's show, you said that you've been starting to go to church in the later years, and you found it not only from a religious perspective, but sort of a community, something that's healthy for you.
Well, I was brought up an atheist. My parents left the Church of Scotland because they disliked the sectarianism of 1960s Glasgow. And so I kind of have a different take on atheism from people who became atheists of their own volition. And my view is that atheism is its own religion. It's a religion of disbelief in God, but it's essentially as much an act of faith as the act of believing in God. The problem with atheism, I was explaining this to a friend just the other day, is that it can work for some, but it can't work for a society. In fact, all attempts to organize societies on the basis of atheism, from the French Revolution to the Russian, have been catastrophic failures. Why is this? I think it's because abandoning any faith in a higher power leaves you prey to your own fears and your own superstitions. It's quite hard to be a strict rationalist when you decide you don't need God. And you also become, and you put this well, somewhat disconnected from your community. I started going to church a while ago when I became a father because I felt that I should at least bring my children up with a religion. You don't arrive at an ethical framework sort of spontaneously. It's not, despite what Richard Dawkins might tell you, not really in our genes. We kind of need to be educated to understand the difference between good and evil, between right and wrong. And actually, I hate to say this in a room full of believing Jews, Christian teaching's kind of good. Christ was a really very interesting thinker with some very radical ideas about how we should relate to one another, which, when you think about them, have a lot of appeal. You can see why they caught on. And I'm going to offend even more people now. They're quite preferable to the things that Muhammad said that one should do in one's daily life. So I have become more and more a fan of Christ's teaching. A big moment for our family was when my wife found her way to Christianity, emerging from a deep depression that I think could be explained by everything from her childhood experiences to the death threats she received over many years. And as a family, I think we've greatly benefited from regular church attendance, thinking about what Christianity means. It's partly practical. It's partly just having one day a week when you're not connected to the world of work and when you are pondering some ethical question. A good sermon just forces you to think about some ethical question. This is good. Even my 6-year-old, though he hates it, is benefiting, subliminally benefiting. It is also strange how restorative it is to engage in worship. And I think one can do this even if one is skeptical about some fundamental teachings. I think one can still benefit from the act of worship. But the most important consequence, I think, is that as a better adjusted individual, you are a better adjusted citizen, and your relations with your fellow citizens, I think, improve. Atomization is a plague of our time. When I look at these damn goggles that we're now expected to wear for virtual reality and total immersion, I have an overwhelming Luddite reaction. I want to take them and break them into small pieces. Because I think a world in which people are on these goggles is a world of almost dystopian fragmentation.
Yeah. Two more questions before we finish, because I know we're going long. But but it is interesting. Yeah. I want to ask something that you wrote a lot about civilizations. We talked about it here. One of the things that every civilization, and I think I heard you speak about it in a number of places, is that they have a sort of end game. Civilizations have a start and an end to them. And throughout time, throughout history, one of the civilizations that seems to stay around for some reason is the Jews. Even though, like we mentioned, the Holocaust, pogroms, the Spanish Inquisition, could go back, whenever. The exile from here, thousands of years ago, we've been through a lot, and we still are here. Lesser numbers where we could have been, because a lot of us died. But why do you think the Jewish identity stays? Because there's no more Romans in the way that they were then, no more Greeks in the way that they were then. There are still Jews.
Well, I grew up in this kind of atheist Calvinist culture, but for some odd reason have gravitated towards the study of Jewish history. I've often wondered why that was. I wrote about the Warburg, the Warburg family. Then I wrote a book about the Rothschilds, probably still the most famous of all Jewish families. And I think the answer to your question is that the operating system of Judaism, the original monotheistic religion, has anti-fragility as a feature, not a bug. It doesn't aim to convert the world to Judaism, but it does aim to preserve and communicate Judaism to successive generations over a very long time horizon. This is what struck me most reading the Rothschilds' letters and other papers, that they had a multi-generational vision of the future. Their time horizon was super long, unlike their competitors who would come along with a kind of get-rich-quick plan and then blow up. The Rothschilds were always planning for the centuries, and that seems to me to be generally true. And that's what I find especially attractive about Judaism, this sense of familial continuity. It's very appealing. And I feel in a weird way at home when I come to Israel, because I find a strong affinity with that aspect of Judaism. So I'm a Philo-Semite. That there should be more of us.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm a Philo-Semitic lapsed atheist. I lapsed from atheism. I lost my faith in atheism and turned to Christianity, but I've retained throughout my religious peregrinations a strong sense of Philo-Semitism and a passionate belief in two things. First, that the Jews should flourish, and not only here in Israel, they should flourish in England and Scotland and the United States and everywhere. And I think it's tragic that great Jewish communities in other parts of the Middle East were destroyed, and that there's barely anything left of some of the Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe. So I would love to see a great renaissance of the diaspora. Secondly, we should all, regardless of our religion, be committed to preventing a second Holocaust. It is as much to be feared as a third world war. And what October the 7th taught me as an historian was they are planning a second Holocaust. And what we saw on October the 7th was a conscious reenactment of aspects of the Holocaust, in particular the grotesque sexual violence. Anybody who's seriously studied the Holocaust knows how big a part that played. So I think we must, to take the broadest possible perspective, understand the state of Israel as part of an anti-second Holocaust defense system. That's how I would think about it. And everybody, no matter where they come from, should have a common human imperative to ensure that that never happens again, that these never again phrases have to be meaningful. If we carry on down the present path in the United States of legitimizing anti-Semitism and violence against Jews, then we are as complicit in a second Holocaust, as the intellectuals of the 1920s were complicit in what became the first Holocaust.
Yeah. Last question, which I think you'll like maybe, is you're writing now the second part of your book about Kissinger, the second book in the series about Kissinger. And I just want, just in general terms, my mom grew up in the Yom Kippur War bout. And one of the things that everyone that I speak, almost everyone, I'm not going to be too general, when they speak about Kissinger, people who grew up at that time, is that they hate him. Like, there's a serious, like an almost automatic hate for him, thinking of like a sort of like a self-hating Jew, someone who had to prove because he was Jewish, he wasn't showing deference towards Israel. So I guess, first of all, is that true? And second of all, when we look at the current Secretary of State, who's also Jewish, is there, and this is like, just say, if you think, I'm just like historically, is there a certain phenomena where Jewish people who are in top positions in the West and are Jewish sort of feel in general that they have to be a little more critical of Israel because they don't want to be seen as double crossing wherever they live?
When that second volume is published, I'll come back for a much longer conversation about just that.
Yeah.
Here I'll give you, as we're running out of time, a very brief response. I think one of the stranger things about Henry Kissinger's career was that he went from being a hero in the eyes of many people, including many Israelis, to being a kind of villain with amazing speed. And I think as the case against him began to grow more popular, when Christopher Hitchens published his book, for example, I think a double standard arose whereby Henry Kissinger was simply judged by different standards from other secretaries of state. And I think there was an element of anti-Semitism in some of the anti-Kissinger writing. In the case of the way Jews think about Kissinger, there are kind of a couple of elements. One is that because Jews left back in the 1970s, as Richard Nixon's national security advisor and secretary of state, Kissinger was bound to be unpopular with a significant majority of Jews just for basic political reasons. And then in the case of Israel, because of the way he handled the 1973 war and the subsequent negotiations, I think Kissinger went quickly from hero to villain here. I mean, almost within a year, from being hailed at the airport to being booed at the airport. Why? I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of harsh because if one looks back on 73 and the subsequent months after the Yom Kippur War broke out, I think he performed a virtuoso feat of diplomacy in ending the war swiftly, 19 days, and then getting Egypt and Israel on a path towards peace. I think that was one of the hardest things he had to do in his entire career. And I think if one looks at the way we currently handle wars, today's diplomats could learn a lot from Kissinger, not least the importance of ending wars quickly, because the longer they go on, the harder they are to stop. Very simple rule of history. So I think Israel has to take a view of Kissinger as somebody who initiated a peace process. It was a phrase he himself coined, that ultimately led Israel out of total isolation on a path, a long and winding path, admittedly, towards reconciliation with the Arabs, beginning with the most populous Arab country. So I think the book will present a more positive picture of Henry Kissinger than other books. But what's in all, it wasn't all great. And I think everybody recoils from some of the things Kissinger was taped as saying to Richard Nixon as he flattered and ingratiated himself with his president. But I think that's the wart, if you like, or part of the disfigurement of a portrait that overall is one of a master strategist and one of the greatest and most original thinkers about statecraft that the United States has ever produced. So that's the kind of trailer. Volume 2, I hope, will come out next year. I'm writing it now. I'm about 12 chapters in. And it's the hardest thing I've ever written because I think that time was about as well documented as any time in history. I mean, every phone call. It's a slow process. And he was everywhere. So you're kind of in the Chilean archives, the Israeli archives, the Vietnamese archives, the Cambodian archives. It's almost never ending.
Jay said the Bangladeshian archives.
There's almost no limit to how many archives I feel obliged to investigate in order to portray him as thoroughly as I can. And I would say it's a bit like a Picasso portrait, a kind of cubist portrait, because I want readers to see him from every angle at once. That's the goal. We'll talk about him more when the book comes out.
Professor Ferguson, it was an honor, and it was interesting, a little long, but it was interesting and a lot of fun. And I just want to say that the fact that you're here means a lot, I think, just to me personally, and hopefully for our listeners and people in Israel in general. And tell us what you found, and we'll love to read it.
I will do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners and viewers. We don't video our episodes, but it's good that we did it. And we'll see you in our next episode. I hope you had a lot of fun.
I look forward to it. Thanks. This is great.